And welcome to the Dynamic Pursuits podcast.
Hello.
This is quite a momentous occasion. It's our first episode and your first podcast.
Yes.
Despite being a well-acclaimed speaker of conferences and publisher of research. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say maybe well-acclaimed, maybe frequent, maybe not more than well-acclaimed.
Humble, as always. We're going to dive into bones today, so let's just kind of get straight into it. From a bone health perspective, we've had a lot of conversations, and this is why I wanted to kind of actually get you on first with this one, because I think the sense is in the conversation that I hear out in the fitness world particularly, people that are, let's say 35, 50, they're athletic, still training, balancing busy lives, schedules and careers and families, that bone health doesn't get the same kind of airtime as a lot of other things. So why is bone health so important from an athletic longevity and just human well-being perspective?
Yeah, so I think you're completely right, as in no one goes to the gym to work on their bones. So I think it's very important because osteoporosis, a condition that is caused by a low bone mineral density, is on the rise and affects millions and millions of people in the UK and tens of millions worldwide. And the problem with things like osteoporosis and osteopenia, which is early onset osteoporosis, is that when you break a bone, it can, especially if it's something like a femur or sort of your hip or something like that, it can be really restrictive in terms of you can't move. And then you start getting things like sarcopenia, muscle wasting, which has a bit of a snowball effect.
Spiral then.
Of course, and then a lot of people that go into hospital in later life with a broken hip, don't come out again.
Yeah.
So there's some stats, something like 1/3 of people who break their hip never leave hospital. Quite morbid, quite early on, but so there's the big implications from that. I think one of the reasons for it doesn't get much airtime is because it is classed as a sort of a later or an older person's type condition. But what you can do in early life is almost offset that decline you get in later life. So your bone mass will decline, there's not much you can do about that, but what you can do in early life is get a really high bone mass, so that decline almost starts higher, and so you get a longer drop, if you like. So when it actually sort of hits, you're I don't know, into three figures. So less concerned about that sort of thing.
So it's almost a start early but this is probably the point, right? It's understanding what's coming down the road at you potentially. Yeah. So what are the things in terms of when does that kind of bone mineral density really, when's the important stage of that from a lifestyle? Because this will probably also, my anticipation is, people can be thinking about it from their own perspective, probably from a long maintenance, but then also if they have got kids, there's an important stage there as well. Definitely.
So in terms of building bone mass, a lot of bone mass building is done in adolescence. So depending on which study you read, you get to your early 20s and your bone mass is almost set. Then there's, like as you mentioned, a maintenance sort of plateau pretty much throughout early adulthood. In terms of the drop, it's different between males and females due to things like the menopause. Then bone mass starts to decline, so obviously perimenopause, menopause, obviously it's been in the news recently, but that's anywhere between sort of early 40s up to about 60, depending on when it happens. Males is slightly later, so 5 to 10 years after that, males tend to get that decline. But obviously things like exercise loading can assist with that maintenance or building of bone. And you mentioned with children as well, there's this sort of idea of like an osteoporosis time bomb, if you like. So if children are inactive during that time when bone building is important, they don't reach that high bone mass, then they sort of plateau at a lower level and then get osteoporosis a lot earlier because they're not coming from as high a drop. And as well, I suppose the pursuits, the sort of physical pursuits which people do. So again, back in sort of the 70s and 80s, sort of the normal middle-aged man would run a marathon. Seemed to be that was what they would do. That seems to have changed a little bit now. So things like cycling seem to be very popular, which obviously are brilliant sort of for cardiovascular and respiratory health.
You have a bias in that regard as well.
I do have a bias in terms of I cycle, but cycling is rubbish for bone.
Yeah.
Rubbish for bone health at all. There's research which suggests in elite cyclists it can actually be negative for bone health. In sedentary, maybe just not good or bad. But it's them activities, that involve a high magnitude of load that are really important for bone. So bone doesn't respond to things like to cycling or walking or anything like that. It's got to have some load to stimulate the response.
I'm going to come back to that in a second. Jumping back in terms of one thing you mentioned about osteoporosis and osteopenia. I often think for some reason that fractured hips often is more like what I would associate with a condition my mum is more likely to get than my dad. Is that because of you touched on before around the menopause and does bone degradation, is that the right word, change at the same rate in males and females? And there's obviously that menopause you mentioned. Is it something which typically affects women more than men?
So that's a sort of a common misconception, but it just tends to occur a lot earlier.
Okay.
Earlier in females, because of the menopause. Then you get that sort of that drop that comes down, and obviously people treat it with sort of pharmaceuticals and things.
Yeah.
It happens in men as well, but you probably don't see that until later. And obviously there's sort of other illnesses and disease that happen then. So it might be someone has hypertension, cardiovascular disease or something else, and osteoporosis might be sort of the least of their worries, if you like.
Yeah.
That's probably more prominent in females just because it happens a lot earlier.
Okay. I was thinking as well, you mentioned around, we're of a generation where we played outside all the time. And I think about now where we live, when I walk around, we're in a housing estate, and when I was the same age as Jack, there would be kids everywhere, every night, and they're just not anymore. There's a group of them that I see that are about 5, but that's about it in this whole kind of area where you would think there'd be like families like ours. Are we in a state where my little boy gets 2 hours of PE if he's lucky a week. If we're not taking him into stuff outside of school, then that is literally that and 30 minutes to an hour of playtime a day, the bone loading that he's getting. And we're going to come on to how we need to move in order to develop bone mass. Are we like I say, that time bomb's coming? Are we thinking that potentially massively underloading kids from a physical activity perspective in relation to bones? Definitely,
I totally agree. I think like you say, there was a lot of outdoor play and things like again, it's this old adage of people don't climb trees anymore.
Yeah.
But I think kids climbing trees, falling out of trees, and sort of realizing jumping around, getting that high load is really positive for bone. And there may be other things that children now do for sort of social pursuits that aren't in the same way, just running about. Mm-hmm. Which I think there's a real risk of that. So in terms of things like, obviously it's well published, the sort of obesity epidemic and the population, not just in the UK but worldwide, seems to be getting larger, seems to be becoming a problem. The same sort of things happening with osteoporosis. Probably because of these sort of lifestyle related factors.
I have to think, having done a lot of work in swimming, that over the years, whenever I've had this land training conversation with swimmers and their parents, I'm like, you guys need to be doing this. It's as important, particularly in those younger years where we are at that stage where we have to develop bone mass for life, effectively. Because some people will be thinking, my kids are active, we're swimming 6 to 8 times a week. And you go, well, actually, in that environment, you're loading no bone, really, at all.
That's the case, So I think in that sort of swimming example, so obviously it's very popular sport for young children to get involved with. And obviously it seems to be taken very seriously in terms of people might train 5-6 times a week and may not have time for anything else. But it's well known that if you swim, that again, like I said with cycling, it's not a good bone related activity if your goal is to strengthen your bones. And I think with that, and we'll come on to it later about the exercise you need to do, but bone doesn't need a lot of stimulus. So it's not like, I've got to do an hour of bone loading to get the benefits. You can do very short amount of time, sort of high load. So research has suggested that anywhere between sort of 10 and 20 reps of high load is enough. I think that sort of land-based exercise for swimmers and cyclists, which may not be depending on who the coach is, may not be their priority. Thinking, why are we doing, I don't know, like plyometrics or something? We should be in the pool. But from an athlete welfare perspective and long-term health, I think they have a duty of care to the athlete, not just to look after them now, but to look after them, into the future. Yeah,
particularly when swimming is a relatively, early specialisation sport. Like, a lot of times they'll probably be done by most swimmers are probably like, I'm not doing this past 20. 22 maybe, and then at that point we've often seen it's interesting when you work with swimmers because they're very much aquatic animals, and you put them on land, and because if they've been good at swimming, they might not have had exposure to hockey, netball, football, whatever, and you get them to try and do some kind of agility and coordination drill, and it's hard for them because they're just not particularly good with ground-based forces.
And I suppose you have to be careful with that as well. Obviously you will need to follow all the sort of periodization type principles if someone is not used to doing them sort of activities.
Yeah, it brings me on. So we've got like at one end of the spectrum, we've got not a lot of bone loading potentially in that population, and then there's the story that I've got to get you to tell, which is the David and Goliath story, which I love around gymnastics and bone density. I tell this to everybody because I just think it's brilliant. But it was super interesting around what happens in young gymnasts.
Yep. So in gymnastics, we know that obviously, like say, swimming's an early specialisation sport. In gymnastics, probably even more so. So what we get is these sort of very young boys and girls who are specialised in gymnastics, training lots, really high amounts of load, and they're going through maturation as well. So the bone is almost working overtime in terms of I'm getting all this high load and I need to remodel so I don't break. And I also need to grow as well and elongate, so that the bone is working overtime. And it's almost like if you imagine a bucket that is available for bone remodelling, that gets used up on our long bones that are liable to breaking, if you like. So the study has looked at bone health in gymnastics and found that they have thinner craniums, and going around that same idea of that, basically the bone is working overtime, and all the constitutes that build bone are concentrating on not breaking bone, and the cranium is obviously normally is a very thick part of the bone because it obviously protects a vital organ, but in these gymnastics it was thinner than their sort of age-matched controls. So that's a study which is obviously true, and I'm not saying David Goliath isn't true either, but so with that almost like a small example, like a real world example, how you're changing something. So that idea of having a thinner cranium because the bone is working over time at the periphery is also true in people that have things like gigantism. So people were born with that sort of overregulation of human growth hormone, they grow really tall. So there's like Robert Wadlow, who for a time was the sort of the longest or the tallest man to ever lived. He was shown to have a thinner cranium. And obviously relates to the same to gymnastics. So going back to the David and Goliath story, so the idea that Goliath is a giant, so obviously he has gigantism, and the reason that David could knock Goliath down with his stone was because he had a very thin cranium, because of his overloaded periphery bone remodelling. So the story goes.
Great, I love it, thank you. So let's get into that bone loading then. The other thing I wanted to just come back into later is around lots of bone injuries, but let's kind of talk about strengthening bone before we talk about rehabilitating bone, essentially. So what do people need to be mindful of in terms of how we build bone density, both in early years and then what we do from a maintenance perspective?
So I think it's load, I suppose, is the thing for bone. Bone needs to be loaded in order to respond. So we did a thing for the Royal Society a few years ago, where it's actually about mission to Mars, astronauts going to Mars. And the idea was it was for children, but there was an astronaut there, and it was, can we get to Mars? And there was all these sorts of ideas about, what would the problems be if we get to Mars? And I was there, again, in the hierarchy of problems in going to Mars, their bones might not be in very good shape either. So what we did is almost have these sort of a force plate setup, and to exemplify what we needed to do, we had children to stamp on these force plates to see how much load they could get. With the idea, it was almost like the end of the pier type, hit a big hammer, see how high you can get it. So I had children to really stamp down on them, and we could see the force tracers, and we had to try and beat their score, and had like a bit of a league table and things. And we're speaking to the parents about this. This is good for bone. You need to load it. Obviously, the astronaut example in a zero or very low gravity area, their bones, again, if you're going to Mars, probably turn to nothing, become very brittle, very low density. Obviously, extreme case. But it was very surprising to know that the parents had no idea that this was almost a positive thing for bone. So things like change in direction, really high forces, but the amount of sort of force required is almost like for a split second. So if you imagine running as fast as you can in one direction, like you would in a team sport, and then someone kicks the ball over your head or sort of drops their shoulder and sort of a bit of a fake, and you have to change direction really quickly, that can produce really high amounts of force at a very specific time, and that causes a massive bone response. The benefit of things like team sports is that there's almost no two turns or no two actions that are the same. So you get this idea of this bone becomes almost holistically strong because you're changing all different directions. There was a study conducted in some long jumpers, and obviously long jumpers, I expect they train, but they definitely perform in a straight line. And they were looking at the tibia, and they showed that anteriorly and posteriorly, their tibia was very strong, but medially and laterally, it was very weak because they didn't have that multi-directional component. And compare that to a team sports player, so like a hockey player, football, a rugby player, all around the bone was a strong element. So in terms of, for anybody really, from both bone creation and bone maintenance, those sort of activities are very good. I would, again, encourage you to sort of maintain that bone mass as high as you can. There was an interesting study from the States where they looked at high school athletes who were part of a track team in NCAA, so their university system. And those that had played basketball or soccer, in their case, in high school before they went to the university, had much stronger bones than those that had just specialised in track running. And it seems to be that sort of sporting pursuits early in life seem to be maintained through later life as well. So again, there's another really interesting study where we looked at team sports players, and it has people that sedentary people. And in that sort of early age, so from sort of 10 to 40, when people are playing those sports, the number of fractures that occur in people that play team sports is greater than those that don't play any sport at all. Right. And these are impact fractures. Obviously, they're not osteoporotic fractures. So you can have the strongest bone in the world. If someone stamps on your foot or something like that, you're going to break a metatarsal. There's nothing we can really do about that. But what happens is when they got to about 50 or 60, the lines stay the same, and then one starts to increase. And it's the people that are sedentary, so they get the osteoporotic fractures, when the people that have played football or rugby or team sport early in life don't get the same number of fractures. Right. And that's even when they stop playing at 30 or 40 years old. Yeah. So that's what they've done in an early life seems to stick with them, all the way through to retirement and later life as well.
So take me through someone that's 44-year-old, and there'll be probably similar age that people listening. I can't create more bone. A sense of I'm not going to remodel, like I can't make my bones thicker. Am I right in that? Or and it's most what I'm just started playing touch rugby partly for the purpose of I recognise that I'm riding a mountain bike, training plyometrics in the gym, but it's not always multi-directional, and there's definitely not enough touch points with that across the week. So like, if I go and hit touch rugby once a week, that's a really multi-directional. But what am I doing in that sense in terms of a positive thing, but what's happening from a bone perspective if I'm not building new or increasing bone mass?
So with that, so there's the studies that have been conducted on lots of large cohorts have shown by taking up them sports sort of like touch rugby and multi-directional sports, people seem to maintain bone mass. Okay. So you don't get that same drop that other people may get later in life. I think it's in terms of like you say, that there are people that say, oh, yeah, I ride a bike, I'm fit, I go to the gym and things. And it doesn't always have to be like a sport. You don't think, oh, I need to join a team and play a sport. So during lockdown, we did something with a team where a team of triathletes who were able to cycle a lot but weren't doing the same sort of running type events, and definitely weren't being able to swim. So we were getting them to sort of second bottom step in their house or wherever they've got a step in the garden, landing from that second bottom step and then jumping in a different direction. And we were asking them to do 20 of these, so 10 to the left, 10 to the right, to get a multi-directional component. But one thing we're asking them to do is to do it in the evening, because they were obviously doing their other sports as well. And we didn't want to sort of almost like push them over or be too energetic for them. And bone does desensitize. So if you load bone too much, there is a point at which it says, I'm not responding to that anymore. I'm not going to remodel. And then you get issues like stress fractures and things occurring. So by doing it at night, we're hoping that they would resensitize during their sleep. And then if they were going for a run in the morning, that short 20 jump protocol was not going to sort of lag or impair anything to do with their actual exercise they were doing for their sport performance.
Great. And with that, I'm going to bridge into something. So the difference then between jumping off the bottom step versus walking. We've spoken about this before, about people, when you mentioned it earlier, that people would be like, oh, I've walked 10,000 steps, and walking is seen to be quite a good thing. And particularly as people get older, they would be, oh, I'm active, I walk. What's the effect of walking on bone density?
Pretty much nothing. Okay, so yeah, and obviously there's walking and there's walking, right? So if someone was fell walking or something like that, so that's a little bit different. But if someone is just thinking, oh, I've done my 10,000 steps, I don't want to demonise walking at all, because obviously it's great for lots of things. But from a bone health perspective, it doesn't really give you that load required by the bone in order to stimulate response. So again, one of the ideas I've had, and it's not come to fruition yet, but this idea that you do 10,000 steps, and obviously lots of people argue, should it be 9,000, should it be 11,000, where's that 10,000 come from? But I think everyone can agree that has got into the public psyche, and you speak to someone who's not into exercise or into science, and they will know about trying to get to 10,000 steps. Like, it's on every smartwatch and app going. So this idea that because that is not good, well, I wouldn't say not good for bone, because it doesn't have a positive effect on bone. Every watch and phone has like an accelerometer built in it. So if there could be something that could pick up them accelerations. So when someone jumps from a step, or when someone does change direction very quickly, it could pick up on that and say, you've created this many G or this much G force, and you've done your amount of load. So similarly to my father-in-law might look at his smartphone and say, I've only done 7,000 steps, and have a walk around the garden at 10 o'clock in an evening just to get his steps up. It might be someone say, well, I've only done 50% of my bone load today. All right, I'm going to hop off this step a couple of times, to make sure that I've done my sort of bone load requirements.
Makes me think of that older generation. Would something like being intentional about climbing stairs, of a serious volume, not just like the stairs in your house, but I mean going upstairs from a leg strength perspective, I'm just thinking of my mum in her 70s, whether that would be a positive thing. Would like that sort of bone loading, because I guess when you get to a certain age, like starting to jump off the bottom step might be, if you've not had that pre-athletic exposure. So
there's a really nice study that's looked at hopping.
Yeah. So
looking at self-supported hopping. So in the study, I think they just used 2 backs of chairs, and it was hopping supported. So really safe activity. Because obviously you wouldn't want to do an activity like, you wouldn't want someone who'd never played touch rugby before to take it up because they want to improve their bone load and then fall and break a wrist or something.
Disclaimer there, well done.
So things like like hopping. And then obviously when you get more confident at it, you move one chair away, and obviously you can build that sort of thing up. But increasing strength. So there's one study that's looked at dropping. So obviously this idea of jumping might, again for some, might be, that's a bit too risky for me. But sort of hanging from a monkey bar or something, and then just letting go and landing, that again has seen to be positive from a load perspective. So the actual sort of energetic demand of the activity doesn't need to be super high. Yeah. And it might start off with something like that, supported hopping, supported jumping, and then you might progress as you see fit.
But it's the impact, and it's the bone deformation, right? So there's some kind of like ground reaction force essentially is going to be, from a low body perspective, the way that we're going to start to create that stimulus for adaptation.
Yes, so I always remember an osteoporosis conference, and the keynote speaker was talking about exercise for bone health, and I think someone asked her a question or something, and she was talking about, do I recommend skiing for people who have a risk of osteoporosis? And her response was, if you are a proficient skier, carry on skiing. Skiing is great for bone. Obviously, the load you get in coming down, and even like stopping, you get a sort of quite high force. But if you're at risk of osteoporosis, if you've got osteopenia, taking up skiing is probably not a good idea, because you're probably going to fall over a lot, and you get a bit greater risk. So you have to obviously be sensible with things. If you can do it in a sort of a controlled environment. And it might be that person needs assistance if they're just starting it and maybe they've not exercised for a while. But even like you mentioned, stair climbing, increasing muscle mass. So we know that the muscle will transfer some of that force onto the bone. So if you have a very strong muscle, you can pull onto the bone as well.
Does strength training stimulate bone? Because this is probably also I'm not going to say misconception, but a premise in the strength training world that I'm squatting heavy, therefore I'm creating or stimulating bone.
Yep. So strength training, resistance training has been shown to be good for bone health. But the only thing with that, so like I mentioned about changing direction, we're looking at 5-6 times body weight in some cases when people are changing direction. Yeah. Even the strongest person is probably not listed in 5-6 times body weight. So in terms of the amount of response. And I mentioned that sort of multi-directional component, which is really important. Again, you're probably not getting that, especially if you're working on a machine or something in the gym. You're probably not getting that same response or multi-directional response as you would do if you're playing an activity or you've got an opponent or something. So multi-directional activity.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. We're going to move on to just a little bit around nutrition, because I know that's also an area that you've looked at, and then we're going to come through to a little bit around so the injuries. Is there anything else that people consider? We've almost got, I feel like there's a hierarchy in terms of priority order in terms of what we can intentionally do from a bone development or bone mass perspective. We've talked a bit about supplements before in this regard, or things that people can be intentional about building into their diet to also support this sort of stuff. Is there anything else that, from that regard, that's worth noting? Yeah,
definitely. So again, there's been lots of studies looking at nutritional supplements and diets and how that might affect bone mass. So I suppose that the big ones will be calcium and vitamin D.
Yeah. And
in a Western diet, people aren't normally deficient in calcium, and they may be in some gentrified areas with only oat milk or something that might be changing, who knows. But most people will have milk in a tea or a coffee or something, or with their cereals or something like that. So calcium is not normally an issue. But there does tend to be an issue with vitamin D. So this military studies done looking at vitamin D and finding that a high percentage, 50% of them are deficient in vitamin D. Especially in the UK, where we don't get much sunlight, and especially, I suppose, like unintended consequences of things like being aware of things like skin cancer and covering up in the sun and applying lots of sunblock. Vitamin D struggles to get through. It struggles to get through to the skin. So vitamin D supplementation is wide. You go to your local supermarket or chemist, and you find relatively cheap supplements of vitamin D. So I say they were the two main ones. There's also things in terms of so creating bone or optimizing bone remodeling is an energetic process. So if you're in calorie deficit, that struggles. Yeah. So again, things like ensure you're eating adequately. Ensure you're having a sort of a balanced diet in terms of the right amount of carbs and protein and things as well, has also been shown to be beneficial. From a bone health perspective.
So if we lead that through then to, you mentioned it before around stress fractures is probably quite a common bone related injury that people might have either heard of or experienced. Yeah. Aside from that, in terms of the general health and fitness space or athletic environment, like you say, traumatic fractures of bone breaks. They're going to be contact-based injuries. We can only do so much to mitigate against those. Yeah. With stress fractures, what's happening there, and is there anything else from a? But why do they occur? I guess is probably the first question.
So people refer to a stress fracture as basically a training error.
Okay.
So it's an avoidable injury. So people that don't exercise don't get stress fractures, and an easy way to stop stress fractures is don't exercise, which obviously is not always a practical solution. So in terms of they occur when the bone is not, in simplistic terms, the bone is not able to keep up with demand. Mm-hmm. So you might have someone exercising, the bone, so the whole remodeling process takes about 3 or 4 months to occur. And you go through various different cycles, including sort of resorption and then forming new bone and then it being mineralized. So when a stress fracture occurs is when you get that resorption, mm-hmm. normally at a specific site. So bone has a site-specific response. So it will only respond and resorb and form where it's been loaded. So again, there's a anecdotal story about back in the day, a long time ago, with archers on boats that would go and invade other countries, and because obviously, again, just stick with me with this. So imagine you're going to invade another country. Obviously, you're rowing. You've got all your strong guys on the oars to make sure you get to where you want to go to, and then when you're going to try and attack these people that you want to get the land from. The children used to be the people that would fire the arrows.
Right.
So if you imagine someone firing an arrow, and you imagine the sort of the musculature and the bone that's involved with that, there's a big pull on the scapula. As the arrow is pulled back. So sometimes these invasions weren't successful, and the ship would be sunk and everyone would die. And then they would go and get the skeletons from the bottom of the sea. And then what they saw were these children, adapting skeletons, one big scapula, one little scapula, because of the continuing to pull the arrow back. In a more up-to-date example, if you were to do an X-ray of the radius and ulna of a tennis player, so obviously you've got a racket arm and you've got a non-racket arm, visibly you can see that the racket arm, the radius and ulna are much bigger than the non-racket arm, and there's another study done in baseball pitchers where you can see sort of exactly the same. So it's that repetitive use. So going back to your initial question in terms of how do they occur, it's that sub-threshold loading. So you can see how the bone responds in that sort of archer example to the load. That will continue to respond all the time and get bigger, like in the tennis player. They get obviously one arm. Tennis players don't pass the racket to the other arm in normal circumstances just to sort of get asymmetry. They'll just do it with one arm. That load occurs and it's always sub-threshold. So it keeps responding and responding and responding. In some cases where training load is too high, or the bone is not optimized in terms of its response, maybe due to a nutritional deficiency, resorption almost outweighs formation, and then you start to get a micro crack form on the bone. So in some cases it might be called like a stress reaction. So micro cracks happen all the time. They're not a bad thing, but normally they're resorbed and then sort of new bone is formed. But in some cases where that lag takes place and formation doesn't occur, that crack elongates and then a fracture starts to happen.
Right.
So common places for stress fracture will be sport dependent. So in cricketers, it's normally lumbar spine. In runners, you might get tibia or metatarsal. There is things like ulnar and radial fractures in tennis players and pitchers as well. So that continuous load without the same response is the reason for them. Yeah. But why do people say it's an avoidable injury? Because it is if training sort of load was right, the stress fracture wouldn't occur. Yeah. But obviously that's a massive simplification. Yeah. There's lots of other things that go into creating an ideal load.
So we're talking about potential scenarios where training load is increased rapidly. in a short period of time, potentially.
Yeah.
I said the nutritional deficits, potentially. They're the major kind of risk factors.
So almost almost an ideal scenario, if you wanted to create a stress fracture, might be like basic military training.
Okay.
So you basically take somebody who is not used to the rigors of basic training. Obviously they have to hit certain marks to get in, but they're not always in line with what they're going to do. And then you sort of go for it, go completely with it. So you might run them, you might have ill-fitting shoes on, you might ask them to carry a big bag that weighs half of their body weight, run for longer than they've ever ran before, and then have some food, wake up the next day and go again.
Possibly under recovered from a sleep perspective because we're up at 3 o'clock in the morning and
for other reasons. And then there's all these sort of challenges as well. So there's a recent sort of chronic relief challenge, but there's been some in the past as well where people have picked up stress fractures because taking someone who may not be a runner and asking them to do this challenge, obviously for very good causes, to earn millions of pounds chronic relief, but you might ask them to run 10 marathons in 10 days or something, which they are not used to. And obviously an elite athlete would struggle to do that, and you're asking an actor or a comedian or something to do that.
What's the time frame of recovery on a stress fracture?
So it depends. So it's almost, if you can catch almost like a stress fracture early, it has less recovery time. If you don't, it sort of tallies with a normal fracture or an impact fracture. You can get sort of niggly stress fractures, which you think they've gone and then they come back again, and then you think they've gone and they come back again. Maybe inadequate repair. A variety of reasons why that might, or it might even be some kind of systemic bone condition. And
the strategy is often the case of deloading for a period of time. You've got to. So this is where the risk is. If you started to try and train for an event where there's a definitive time point where we need to perform, the risk of overtraining, overreaching in those situations, because actually it wipes you out potentially, depending on where that proximity of the event is.
So two examples off the top of my head. Mo Farah and Paul Radcliffe have both missed Olympic Games due to stress fracture, and that's probably obviously the sort of the riches that are involved with going to the Olympics and winning medals might cause someone to overdo it and increase their training load and thinking, if I do a bit more, I can get a little bit better, but then going too far and then the bone breaking down as a result. Yeah,
great, thank you. That's awesome. Is there anything else that I've not asked you about bone injuries that you think people should know before we move on to the hot topic of identifying bullshit research?
No, I think there's, to sum up, I think from a bone perspective, we know that loading is good, and I think I don't think anyone should almost be scared to load. Obviously, in a safe manner. I mean, we mentioned children earlier on, but that's where you get almost like most bang for your buck in terms of get your kids to run about, jump, change direction. That's great. Get them to stamp up and down. I saw something on LinkedIn the other day where someone had drawn a hopscotch on a pavement and then had a camera, and people, as they were walking along, were just doing hopscotch because it was there. So even that sort of activity, that hopping-based activity, is really good. So if it can become almost like that sort of habitual activity that people just do, and it's not almost like, I'm going to go and train my bones, because I don't think that will ever happen. But if it can be worked into a normal routine. So what I mentioned before about that with the long jumper of that medial lateral weakness, they had a big problem with track runners getting bone stress injuries. So they introduced lateral movements into their training routine. For the very reason of increasing bone mass. And I think, like you mentioned, swimmers as well. Obviously, coaches have a duty of care, not only to obviously make the athlete the best they can be, but also to their long-term welfare. If that is from an osteoporosis perspective, or leaving someone liable because haven't done enough loading when they were younger, or pushing someone too hard and they break down with a stress-based injury, I think two sort of extremities to deal with.
It's super interesting when you think about just the bigger picture of this, of how the body is going to be able to just respond over a lifetime, I think, and often when we've got young kids, and particularly if they're talented, we see the opportunity to go and put them into a specialisation quite early because of the amount of hours and time and commitment it takes to be able to be a performer in one of those sports. But when we look at it from a physical preparation perspective in strength and conditioning, we'll all sing about athletic development and generalism and play lots of different sports when you're a kid and avoid this early specialisation, even though we've got sports like gymnastics which almost demand it because of the, well, if you're 16-year-old, right, in the sport potentially.
Yeah.
But it's just going back to that stage of just going be that generalism. And it's not always, I think, the sexiest side of what people want to do because they like being good at a thing and being known for a thing. But that's great until you're 65, 70 years old and you're struggling because we've maybe just not prepared well enough like decades before. It's a tough ask, as you say. No one's going to get sexy about bones, like, I'm going to trim my bones. Like, it's just, it needs to be part of just a bigger narrative.
Definitely, and I think, like I said about doing that session with the Royal Society, where there's a massive knowledge gap in terms of, oh, I didn't know bones responded in that way. I didn't know I had to do that for bones. Or I didn't realise that walking, swimming, cycling weren't good for my bones. So I think where we can, sort of changing that sort of knowledge gap to ensure that people know this is a good thing, and can incorporate it into when your kid is jumping off the bed, maybe don't shout at them too much. You can do it 10 times and then that's enough.
It's crazy when you go back to what you said at the beginning around the morbidity rates of people that have had fractures in that period of their life, and this crazy thing of going in for a hip fracture or a fracture of some variety and then not coming out because you kind of. But then even if you do come out, the quality of life. I've said this for years. Like, movement is life, and as soon as you can't move, your life's going to get pretty miserable. So
it's the functionality, isn't it? And and if you've got something like a neck of femur fracture or something, you can't go anywhere. Then it's like a snowball effect starts to happen.
Crazy. All right, so I've got, as an academic, seasoned, I wanted to do a little bit to kind of close this out, just around helping people to understand. It doesn't necessarily need to be strictly within the realms of injury and illness from a research perspective, but as somebody who studies research and has published a lot of research, it feels to me that at times social media, particularly in the fitness industry, can be a bit like the Wild West. If people can go onto Google Scholar, they can find a research paper, it backs up their point that they're trying to make, and all of a sudden it's kind of presented and it almost adds credibility because it's been published. And if people are not clued into the fact that not all research is created equal, let's say, that can look like, oh, well, it must be right because it's been published in a scientific journal. When you start going through the research articles and you start looking through the pecking order of journals, and you've got, some of them are randomly named, aren't they? You read it and you're like, that's just not a very legitimate publication.
No.
Talk to us a little bit around that. What are the kind of the red flags around how things people should be aware of to be a little bit more discerning of what information they should pay attention to? So
it's really difficult, and especially for someone who's not in academia and just reading a journal article which looks, again, I'm not going to say not legitimate, but it looks like a decent journal article. I think one of the issues which happen a lot with the sort of the increase in social media, people aren't really reading a lot of the articles. They're reading the abstract, they're reading the headline and saying, that supports whatever narrative that I'm trying to spin.
And sorry to interrupt, that's not helped, is it? It's better now, but when I first started, most journal articles were locked down. You couldn't read the whole thing anyway. So even the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, like we've spoken about this before, even through my university credential, I cannot get access to those papers without requesting them. So your average person can't go on PubMed and read a whole article from that journal. They can only get the abstract, which the author has written, and doesn't often include the details which you would need to know to discern whether it is a good study or not.
Of course, yeah, definitely. So then that's improving now. So that they are becoming more accessible, and sort of open access is certainly a lot more common than it used to be. In terms of things sort of like warning signs, so there are predatory journals. So I think I'm not alone with getting hundreds of emails from people wanting you to publish in their journal, and saying they'll turn it around quickly and we only charge like thousands of pounds for publishing it. And so a red flag for me as an academic is when they're saying, well, firstly spelling my name wrong and things like that when they're sending me an email, but also like I don't do any research in things like cancer or anything, but they're asking me to publish in a cancer journal, and so that they can be sort of instantly deleted. I think from almost like a consumer reading things, I think one red flag would be people overstating the findings. So I think there is no magic bullet or magic pill or magic supplement that does everything. So if you read through an article and someone said that this will stop you getting an injury or this will improve your performance by 10%, it's probably nonsense. So I think that's a red flag, and that old adage of if something looks or sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Injuries, that they're complex, and it's normally not just one thing that occurs or the sort of the inciting event is probably not the only thing that caused the injury to happen, especially from a non-contact, like a soft tissue injury. It's probably a lead up to that inciting event causing that to happen. So I'd say that would be quite a big one. There is you can get a list of almost like reputable journals. So from a sport and exercise science basis, there's a thing called impact factor. So with impact factors, again, people will argue about the merits of impact factors, but if something hasn't got an impact factor, it takes 3 years to create one. That's a little bit of a red flag. It might be just an up and coming journal that's not got that sort of history, but always read that article a little bit closer, seeing where is this from, why is it published in here, why has it not gone to it's almost like a perceived better or bigger journal.
And the higher the impact factor, effectively the more scientifically rigorous or robust the study
in some
needs to
cases.
be.
So there's lots of metrics. So there's like citation metrics, and there's there are some places that publish a lot. Or some journals that publish a lot. So they get high impact factors because that the work that they're publishing is being cited and that sort of thing. But they're putting out maybe 20, 30 articles every single day, which I think some people have got a little bit wise to now. That how are they getting through the review process with this many articles? I suppose my answer is it is difficult. One thing I would do as well is look at the authors. Obviously, there's affiliations for where them authors are based at. If you're looking at something you think it's really interesting, have a look at the author, see if they've published elsewhere, or it might just the author might be a postdoctoral student or something, so it might not be that they're not published, but there would normally be someone more senior on there, so you can look at their sort of back catalogue of where they've published and see if they're sort of a reputable person. But of course, everyone's got to start somewhere. But you can probably imagine the sort of things that I review papers as well as writing them. Some of the things that come through to be reviewed, are really questionable. There's ethical standards as well as sort of study design. You're surprised that they get some of that sort of thing get through the net.
And we often probably also just bear in mind things like sample sizes. Repeatability. If it's the first paper to report novel findings, you might be also a bit sceptical about that. And study design in itself is probably something also where there's a hierarchy, right, in terms of kind of a more robust approach to designing a study methodology. Yeah,
definitely. So there's two ends to this in terms of from an applied perspective. So if you want to do a study with the elite of the elite, it's going to probably be very difficult to get that control in place and get a methodological design that sort of fits in with the rigours of excellent science. So you have to, if you want to, let's say you wanted to look at the Jamaican sprint team from the sort of the Usain Bolt era, which obviously would be fascinating to look at, to do a study with them and see how they perform and things like that. You probably couldn't do a randomised control trial with a placebo and things within that population, because the population is small and you've probably only got a really small amount of access to them. So it's almost like if you had a study and it's like, or do I do it in them where I don't have much control, or do I do it in university students where a lot of the populations for studies come from, where, yeah, who cares if this university student runs a little bit faster, they're running 100 metres in 15 seconds rather than 16 seconds. It's probably not that interesting, even though you've got lots of control. People are probably more interested in the elite athletes, in some cases. So there's that balance, and there is probably a middle ground somewhere where you can try and put that control in place, but it's still in a relevant population, rather than someone who is very untrained or not specifically trained in what you're actually looking at with them.
That's an interesting training, isn't it? Because you're like, oh, we reported these strength gains in these people. You read the research, like, we've never been in the gym before, so we can't actually we can't determine anything from that, apart from somebody who doesn't train got better when they did train.
I have seen a study before where they've looked at adolescents and reported strength gains after like a year's training program. But what they didn't also note is that strength training program seems to have caused them to grow 6 inches, which that you can't almost like tie your strength program that they're going to grow anyway regardless of that.
That's perfectly segues into one of my final questions, was like, I think people often misunderstand that correlation and causation.
Of course.
Just touch on that to kind of clarify that, because often I think people don't always critically evaluate the two.
So we teach our students this, and there's this, you can look onto this, and there's quite sort of funny examples of it. So there's one that I think I've used recently. There's almost like a perfect correlation between films that Nicolas Cage has starred in and people that die by getting trapped in their bed sheets. Which obviously there is not blaming Nicolas Cage for this, for the people getting trapped in their bed sheets. But obviously there is no causation between the two. So it is important, there is a mechanistic reason of why those things happen, which is why it's important to have a control group for these sorts of studies. Saying that, is it that training program that caused them to increase in height by 6 inches? Or is it just that they were going through maturation period?
And they just got stronger.
And they just got stronger, they just got taller. It's nothing actually that's taken place there. So I think that's an important one. But with the caveat to that, if you're looking at, we'll go back to the Jamaican sprint team, it's probably quite hard if you're let's say we're looking at, supplement A, and we're seeing if it improves Usain Bolt's sprint time. It's probably difficult to get a control group that is as good as that group to see if that improves. Does that mean that research shouldn't take place in that high level athletes? And then it becomes almost a bit more case study like, which I still think has merits, but probably doesn't have the scientific rigour of another study, but arguably in a more interesting population.
It's where the application goes, isn't it, at that point? Because when I speak to students, I'm always coming at this from an applied perspective and saying, I actually, in many cases, from an elite sport standpoint, don't really care about the 99, because if it works for my one, then I'll use it.
Of course,
But then when we are starting to take information from a general health and wellness perspective for the population and go, we think that this is going to be a good strategy, that's when we're starting to go, we need to know that works in more than 95% of people to be confident that it's a good strategy. But in elite sport, if it works in the 1%, it works in the 1%. That also could be just because that's that unique athlete genetic makeup that responds particularly well to that type of response and training.
Of course, and that's something definitely to be aware of. But, and again, there might be something that's, so nothing's 100%, right? So in some cases, you might have a training protocol that, again, increases increases muscle mass by 5% or something. That's not going to be 5% in everybody. Some people might increase by 10%. Other people might increase by 0.1%. We're looking at the mean with these things. So when I always remember that the Lucozade advert from the 90s, it was like 33% longer. It was John Barnes. That is a mean. And I think, again, there's problems with that study in terms of they were comparing it to basically nothing. But that is the mean response. That is not the actual response. So another example of that is this sort of 10,000 hours of training. Despite that study being conducted in pianists rather than any sort of sports people, it's got into people's psyche. They have to do 10,000 hours to master a certain task. It's not like you you're on 9,999 and you're an amateur, you do that 1 extra hour, then you become elite. That is a mean value. And some people could train for 20,000 hours and still not be at that elite status. Other people, there's quite notable examples who have become elite at 15, 16 years old, and impossible to get 10,000 hours of training in order to do that. So I think, being aware and research in general that, we're looking at mean values in the populations, and your response may be better, it may be worse. Just something to be aware of.
So probably final question, because I'm not really like a gifted academic, I often feel like I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing in the academic environment, which brings an applied perspective to the students, which I think adds value from a development perspective or a learning perspective. But I still, honestly, even though I've got a master's of research, don't find picking out research that easy, because you often don't have time to go through the detail that you might do if your job is effectively to critique and evaluate research and decide what we can do with it. So if somebody's listening to this and they've heard the conversation and say, I do want to be a little bit more tuned into what I'm reading, is there some easy ways that people can start to discern high quality information from less or lower quality, and what to do around application of the sorts of things that they're getting exposed to? What questions should they be asking? And it's a tricky thing to kind of unpick if you are an enthusiastic fitness athletic type person, doesn't work in the scientific field. Like, how do they discern good from bad?
So in terms of choosing research articles, so the first place to start, so there are many search engines that we'll be able to access research articles from. So things like PubMed, there is Google Scholar as well, and these are free to access articles in some cases. Some are still behind a paywall, but in some cases if you email the author and say, could you send me a copy? I've never not sent anyone a copy if someone wants a copy of one of my journals, or my papers, should I say. So that's probably a good place to start.
It's almost as they said, do your own research in that sense. So rather than just accept what you're being told by somebody else, actually you've got to go and take the time to do your own reading.
So there's lots of things as well. There might be an article online, and it might have these sort of headline results of what they've done, but then normally they'll put a link through to the actual paper. So what I would suggest is actually spend some time actually reading that actual paper. Again, in terms of its sort of if it's a reputable paper, depending on when it's published, if it's published a few years ago, you could look for citations. Has this been cited continuously? So there are rare occasions where something is cited but for the wrong reasons. So it might be an example of really bad research that's cited a lot. But in normally, if something is cited heavily, it's for a good reason. So you could have a look at that. And so if your citations, again, obviously it depends on the area and depends when it was published, but if you're looking at sort of over 30, 40 citations, that's a good amount of citations for a paper. Then once you've got that, you can read through it, and depending on what area you're looking at, sometimes it might be quite heavy in terms of like you read through it and you might have to Google some words. It might send you off on a different paper to explain something. But I would say stick with it if you're interested, to have almost a deeper understanding of what, firstly in the introduction of what the area is about, which should give you a brief, almost like synopsis of it. Then find out from the method what they've actually done. And in there, if it's like a training protocol or something, they should give you very clear information of what was conducted, going down to the level of sets and reps and things like that, if it was a strength training protocol. And then from that, you can look at the results. Some of the statistical analysis might be a little bit complex, but you can see what their findings were. And then almost you can make an opinion based upon that. In the discussion, you can read through and see how it compares to other literature, see if there's any sort of conflicting information. But once you've got to that point, you should be able to say, okay, this sounds plausible. I can see what's happened with this. And even if I'm going into a new area, it takes me a bit of time to read a paper in a new area, because you need to have a sort of deep understanding of it. The more you read around the area, the better understanding you get. And then sometimes when you're reading an introduction, it's like, I know this information, I know the area, I don't need to go into this in as much detail, and you can almost like breeze through it and see what they've actually done from a method perspective. That's
super helpful. It's made me smiling when you said that, because there's times when I've seen a strength training piece of research And I've gone through and read it, got the paper, and you go to the methodology section, and I see the photos that they've included of the person doing the exercises which they've used. And the technique is so bad that I'm like, if that's what you've chosen to include, like I've got absolutely no confidence that you've actually...
That's your best picture.
Yeah, that's the best one, of someone doing a push-up like a banana. And I'm like, we're just not going to... I can't be confident that's going to be good. The research or the results can be conclusive. I think I also find, just from tips from as a non-academic person, systematic reviews and meta-analysis are good because it's based on a bigger body of research. Someone has done the job of pulling a lot of papers together.
Yeah. And
I also find that from a very top-level perspective, if you go onto something like PubMed and you start searching the search term, you find a paper, you look at other papers and similar articles, you'll often find that there's probably equal as number of papers that are saying that what that paper that you are looking for has said works, doesn't work. So you'll often find information to the contrary. And straight away when I see that, when I've got opposing viewpoints or findings, I'm straight away going, I need to be a little bit more skeptical about this, because somebody might have picked a paper which supports their viewpoint and ignored. It happened to me recently. I was looking at symptom modification around shoulder pain, and I can find some papers which are 2016, Jeremy Lewis, perfect, and then you've got other stuff which is up a bit more to date where people are contesting it. Then you've got to go into and go, well, which one of those do I stand in, and what am I going to do with that information? Because I think the application is also so important for people of understanding what am I going to do with the research, like what context you're applying it in, and how nailed on do you need it to be, or are you just an inquisitive person and going to find out what happens and see what I learn from applying these.
Definitely, and I think sometimes if there's a lot of journals now putting practical implications in, because they realise that it's not just for a scientific community. People need to know what to do with this information. But on another point, again, if you find an author that you quite like, you can search the author in these search engines as well, and almost like read their almost back catalogue if you like. Like you would do if you heard a song and you quite like the artist. Yeah,
I did that for you in preparation for this. Over 50 articles in PubMed.
You might you might find out other songs they've sang. That's almost like a good practice to see. Where has this come from? Because normally there is a bit of a trail. Yeah. They haven't just thought I'm going to publish this. They did this first and they looked at that, and again you can almost like pin things together.
Mate, thank you so much for that. There's been some absolute gold in there. As I say, conversations that I don't often hear people having, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of get you on the podcast as a first guest, to actually bring some of that conversation to the fore, because it's just refreshing to hear some of the stuff that people maybe aren't aware of, what they can do about it, and just develop their own knowledge and make their own decisions effective about their training for the longevity. And I think also for our population of people that are likely to listen to this, their families as well. So if I'm sitting there with older parents and young kids, I'm looking at this from both perspectives. So I hope there's been a ton of value in there, which I'm sure there will be when people listen to it. So thanks for coming on.
Bro, thank you.